Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us again. I'm your host, Jason Brand, the Director of Outreach and Partner Development here at Supply Chain Solutions. And today we've got our freight market roundup. So a couple things. First of all, I apologize. I am a little under the weather right now, so you may hear some extra sniffles, some extra coughs. I've got a half gallon of water next to me, so I'll make sure I use that generously. But we're going to make this show nice and quick. We're going to call it a freight market roundup blitz today, and there's a couple reasons why. So we're currently in the process of temporarily shifting our marketing superstar who's just kept the lights on and kept this show going for so long, and just temporarily leaving him for a little bit. And in that process of handing the keys over, we're still trying to figure out how to get everything to work. And just to make sure the post-production work doesn't take as long, we're going to have a couple slightly shorter episodes over the next few weeks, but we're going to be back up to regular length here pretty quick. So bear with us as we get through this transition. This is our first live episode of the new year, so thank you very much for joining us. And like I said, let's get the show on the road. So Freight Market Roundup. Real quick, what we're going to cover today is what our customers are currently paying when it comes to ocean rates. And we're going to focus on the major ocean shipping lanes. Obviously, we've got a bunch of one-offs, a bunch of, small locational shipments. But we really want to look at like what's happening, big picture, macro. So let's zoom out. Let's take a step back. Let's talk about what's happening with our Trans-Pacific lane. And specifically, we're going to focus on shipments that are leaving the ports in Southeast Asia and China and headed into the U.S. West Coast ports. Now, if you've been shipping on this lane, I know for a fact you have been feeling the Chinese New Year squeeze, not to mention the Trump squeeze, not to mention that labor negotiation squeeze. So if we look back more than a month and a half ago, our customers were paying right around the $3,800 point. Now, that was for a 40-foot container. Obviously, I'm talking about $3,800. But if you booked a shipment this week on that lane, you probably had a mini heart attack when you saw your bill for over $5,000, because that's what's happening. Now, if we actually let's shift that. Let's talk still about those Chinese and Southeast Asian shipments, but now instead of heading into the U.S. West Coast, let's go all the way around to the East Coast. We're seeing basically the same thing. Let's look at that timeline logic. So, a month and a half ago, shipments were costing right around $5,200 per 40-foot container, and today, this week at least, they're costing around $6,500. Now, there are some more reasons why than what I discussed above, and we're going to dive into those over the next couple of weeks. But for now, let's move on. Let's keep talking about those macro rates that we're seeing. So let's keep looking at our shipments that are leaving Southeast Asia and also leaving China. But this time, I want to talk about them that are heading into Mexico, specifically the Mexican West Coast ports. Now, we introduced this lane actually the beginning of last year because it was really a canary in the coal mine. It told a great story of what was happening in the North American market. And it kind of was, it's a little bit more of a sensitive lane to some of the global pressures. So you kind of can see things a little bit more dramatically, which can be helpful to tell a story of what's going to be happening in the US market. And, as I just mentioned, it's still telling a pretty unique story. So what we've really seen here since November is the shipping price sort of bouncing off a price floor, so to speak. So starting around mid-November, we watched this lane really oscillate between a high of $3,800 and a low of $2,800. Obviously, those are per 40-foot containers. And really, to explain what's happening here, we are watching these massive GRIs take place at least once a month, if not twice a month. And they've pumped up that shipping price to that high point of $3,800. But then just after a couple of days, we witnessed those prices swiftly retreating back down to that floor price of right around $2,800. And we witnessed this happening all the way through the beginning of January. And then after the last GRI on January 3rd, we've seen the price actually just continue to go down. So right now, what our customers are actually paying is $2,400 per 40-foot container, or FEU, to ship on this lane, which is pretty remarkably cheap considering the mileage. And, it's important to note here that, this lane has seen some substantial volume over the course of last year. That's why we actually brought it in, why we started talking about it. We had a lot of customers shipping on it. And along with that volume came a lot of capacity injections from the carriers as well. But the story we're seeing play out right now is one of oversupply and, quite frankly, weak demand. But that's not particular to this lane. This is actually pretty usual for this time of year. So don't, be too dramatic about that. Now, it's also important to mention that we do have a lot of shipping alliance shakeups happening just over the next few weeks, if not months at the most. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this lane gets affected by those changes, but also other lanes, because there are quite a few service strategy changes happening, and some are pretty major. But anyways, we're going to cover that in the next few weeks. Let's continue on. Now let's move from our trans-Pacific lanes, which we've been discussing, over to our transatlantic lanes. And we're going to start with shipments leaving European ports and headed into the U.S. East Coast. Now, for these shipments, what we have been seeing is some pretty surprising price stability. Currently, our customers are paying right around $2,700 per 40-foot equivalent unit, or FEU. And they have been paying right around that same amount since about a week and a half after the October 1st strike. So there is a question that needs to be asked here, and that is, how is this new presidential administration, as well as how is this new labor contract going to affect these rates? And at this point, it's really hard to say. I mean, if you just look at that new labor agreement, that ultimately is going to raise prices. But when you start to factor in the Trump administration, there are some things that he's been proposing, and it really makes this sort of a wild card here. And, we do hate to say this. We love to have at least some direction to point you. And, unfortunately, we do have to say this a lot, but this is kind of a wait and see moment. And particularly what we need to wait and see for is the dust to settle around a lot of the statements that were said during the campaign. And we really need to understand, for example, what is going to be happening with these tariffs. Now we're hearing February 1st, but specifically what is going to be happening with these tariffs. And then also, just another example, because there are a few things we need to know on, but as another example, what's going to happen with U.S. businesses headquartered in tax havens for Ireland, as an example. So until we have a good idea of what his foreign policy approach is going to be like during this new current administration and what it's actually going to entail in practice, it's kind of hard to make assumptions. And furthermore, it's even harder to make predictions, because if you can't make accurate assumptions, how are you going to make a good prediction? Anyway, let's continue. Obviously, food for thought, and obviously stuff we're going to be unpacking in the next couple of weeks as well. But before we move on and leave these European shipments, let's talk about the European shipments that are headed not to the East Coast, but to the West Coast. And what we're seeing here on the West Coast is actually a pretty similar trend to what we saw on the East Coast. We saw shipping costs spike right around the same time as that October 1st strike, which obviously happened on the East and Gulf Coast ports. But then, just like what happened with those East Coast shipments, the cargo that was bound for the West Coast ports has not seen a price cut since as well. So currently, our customers are paying right around the $4,000 per 40-foot equivalent unit point. Now, let's wrap up our Blitz Freight Market Roundup today, and let's talk about what's happening on our China and Southeast Asia headed to Europe lane. And, quite frankly, we have neglected this lane a lot recently. And that's because, in some cases, it really wasn't grounded in reality. The changes that made this lane go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope and the avoidance of the Suez Canal and what happened with the transshipping points, it just was so many variables that needed to be discussed individually. And the rate and kind of showing what our customers were paying over time wasn't telling an accurate story of the lane or the market itself. But we are starting to see what could be some stability and what could be a return back to the Suez, given that ceasefire that just was announced. So right now, our customers on this lane are paying an average of $3,900 per FEU, which is really quite a steal considering just the crazy amount of mileage they have to cover still. And also what we're witnessing is this price rapidly dropping. I mean, we are expecting, if no GRI is implemented, we could easily hit $3,500 within the month. So keep that in mind. Now, I did mention ceasefire, and we've got a couple analysts here that are saying, they're going as far as saying that commercial shipping, it could resume its normal route through the Suez Canal as soon as late February. And those same analysts, those same predictors kind of left this big asterisk out there. And I just want to read this word for word. Under the most optimistic of conditions. And I could not agree more. I do not think that's possible in any way, shape, or form. But let's get down to the brass tacks here. So for these February sailings through the Suez to become a reality, we would have to have the 6-week ceasefire begin no later than January 19th, which it did. And the hard part is that ceasefire would have to stick. And just to be clear on this, like I mentioned, the ceasefire did begin, but we've already had military operations since the ceasefire started. Take that as you may. Now, that's just phase one of this to allow for late February Suez Canal sailings. The other two phases are going to be equally hard, if not more difficult. They're going to require a full withdrawal from Gaza of Israeli forces and also a rebuilding plan in place for the territory. So I really hate to be the Debbie Downer here, but I would not get your hopes up for February trips to the Suez. And quite frankly, I think that considering late February as a starting point is not in the realm of possibility. I think that's just completely delusional. But let's wait and see. If there are ships sailing through the Suez by late February, then I'm not going to say I'm going to eat my hat because this is my SCS hat of choice. But we're going to have to do something about it. And to this point that this may actually occur, the Houthi rebels actually did release a statement saying they're going to focus their attacks only on Israeli vessels. So kind of saying, hey, other vessels, you may be allowed to come back through here. So maybe it is possible. But, if it requires that ceasefire working, history's taught us anything. Anyway, big thanks for everybody joining us today. I'm really looking forward to seeing you all again next week. I really appreciate you guys joining us. Remember, shorter shows for the next couple of weeks as we kind of work out some of the kinks, and then we'll be back to a regular length. But we've got a lot to cover, and we're excited to have you guys along the ride. So hope you're having a great start to the new year so far. We'll catch you again next week. Thanks. Bye.